Welcome, everybody. My name's Gary Fortney, and this is The Trend. Thank you all for joining us again on The Trend podcast. We're going to turn things a little bit towards the cult that we started, the cult, I guess, how would we want to word this? Cult leaders who are very influential in people and the behavior that people displayed regarding being influenced by somebody with a lot of power or charisma, as we previously had discussed. So anyways, we talked about Charles Manson previously. We talked about Jim Jones regarding Jonestown. And now we're going to talk about an individual named David Koresh. David Koresh was a cult leader. I'm going to call it a cult. And it's an incident that happened in Waco, Texas on February 28th of 1993. And when the incident happened on 2/20/93, it was one of the longest, I want to say, sieges, confinement, and negotiations that has taken place in the country regarding trying to negotiate with David Koresh the surrender and or release of the people who were in his compound, as well as a number of children. So it lasted 51 days until April 19th of 1993, and a lot of things happened during that time period. So first, we're going to talk about David Koresh himself, a little bit of background, who he was, the influence he had on people, what his compound was. We'll talk a little bit about the ending of what happened at the Waco incident, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what were the implications and the second disaster that happened as a result of the Waco incident. So today we have a special agent or senior special agent retired, Tony Piwowarcyzk. Tony retired from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives after 32 years of service. Tony's been on some previous broadcasts with us, so he's back with us today. And when we were talking about the child deaths that happened in 1993, and also talking about various incidents, when I had my old partner, Detective Laura Nearing, on, we actually worked the case. We worked the cases personally. When we talked about the Pam Hupp case or the other case involving her, we had Brian Hilke, who actually worked the case, one of the investigators. And a lot's been said about Waco, a lot's been said about David Koresh, but actually Tony Piwowarcyzk was actually on site down in Waco during the subsequent incidents that happened, as well as the negotiations that took place. So with Tony being down there at Waco when it happened, we're going to talk a little bit about David Koresh and a little bit about the incident that happened. And we're going to continue on again to the Oklahoma City bombing in a subsequent episode. We'll talk a little bit about what happened there. So, Tony, thanks for joining us today.
Good afternoon, Gary. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. Good to have you here. Yeah, thanks for joining us today. Waco is kind of hard to talk about, especially for retired ATF agents, because several agents were killed at the time of the original attempt to arrest and investigate the children who were inside the compound. The investigation started a couple of different ways, but I'm going to let Tony get into that. So I want to hand it to Tony for being here talking about the Waco incident, especially with the agents that were killed on site. But we're going to talk more about Koresh and the charisma that he had over those people. So, Tony, hope you can provide some insight for us about a little bit about the case. So I'll let you begin. I'd like to start with this, the entire case here that lasted for 51 days.
I think you need to begin with David Koresh himself. I don't purport to understand him or his philosophy, but to briefly hit on that and how he had influence over the group known as the Branch Davidians. David Koresh was kind of a loner. He did enjoy music. He eventually found his way to a group called the Branch Davidians, which is a subset of the Seventh-day Adventists. And in 1955, a Davidian named George Roden broke off and started what was known as the Branch Davidians.
So Koresh didn't start it. He just continued on from somebody who had started previously?
Yes, he joined the group known as the Branch Davidians in 1981. And over his time there, he befriended the founder's widow, and there are some accounts that he had a sexual relationship with her. She was 61 years old at the time.
Well, Koresh must have been pretty young then at the time too. So
He was born in 59, so that would have put him at 21, 22 years old.
Wow.
And so he became entrenched in the group. His charisma developed. He used his music to bring people together so that by 1985, he had a following within the Branch Davidians that listened to him preach. Lois Roden encouraged him as the group's, Lois being the group's leader at the time, to teach through his music and to keep communicating with the younger group. So by 85, he had a regular teachings and sermon time. Then in the group kind of polarized after her death. She wanted her son to take it over. And their faction between George and David Koresh, who was originally Vernon Wayne Howell, developed. Violence was not unusual to his development. In 87, there was an armed confrontation on Mount Carmel property between George Roden, who was the leader of the Branch Davidians, and Vernon Wayne Howell, George David Koresh, over control of the Branch Davidians.
Wow.
David Koresh came on property with 7 of his followers armed, and a gunfight ensued. No one was killed, but they were tried on charges of attempted murder, and the jury acquitted the 7 followers, and David Koresh's trial ended in a mistrial. So that was in like 88, and by 89, the property was up for sale due to taxes. So that's when Vernon Wayne Howell moved. They paid the back taxes and assumed control of what is currently known as Mount Carmel.
So it's interesting. A lot of people heard the name David Koresh, but didn't know his real name, that was not his real name. He had changed his name.
He changed it in 1991 out in California, and he listed it as for business and publicity purposes that he was changing his name.
Was there something behind the name Koresh, or was there any reason, or that's just the name he chose?
Well, there's 2 things. He was rooted in the Bible. He had a lot of familiarity with the Jewish faith and the Hebrew lifestyle and Israel. And he took David because of David was King David from biblical times. And King David was the one to lead the Israelites to their promised land. And David Koresh thought he would become influential in Israel prior to like 1990, where he would claim his fame and his martyrdom. 91, he took the first name David, and then Koresh from the Hebrew means son, S-U-N, but it also relates to King Cyrus, who led the Israelites out of Persia. So that's what Koresh meant. So David Koresh was the son of David, was the leader of the Israelites. Koresh was Cyrus, king of Cyrus, who led the Israelites out. And by 91, Koresh, between 85 and 91, 85 and 91, the Branch Davidians that followed David Koresh lived in tents and buses in the desert outside of Palestine, Texas. So when they gained control of Mount Carmel, Vernon Wayne Howell led his followers back onto the property. And thus, David Koresh came to be as he led his people back to the promised land.
Well, what's interesting as we're talking here is the word charisma. Because remember, we talked about Charles Manson previously, and we also talked about Jim Jones in Jonestown. And anyways, the charisma and the influence that these individuals have over what we consider normal everyday people, and how I would use the word brainwash. I would use the term such an influence to have these people do things that are so out there that people can't comprehend how they would do this.
But also, you got to remember that the Branch Davidians were not just a cult that came into being based in the Seventh-day Adventist and the church that had solid religious beliefs. David Koresh tuned those beliefs towards his narcissism. So there was a deep religious following. Some of these people that were involved with David Koresh, their families had been Branch Davidians for generations. So it was rooted in true religion. But David Koresh, his charisma, his ability to turn the Bible, and he believed he was the only one who could interpret the Bible to his followers, especially the book of Revelation, which will later on, he would always talk about the end times, or we know it as the end of times, but his was the end time.
Well, like kind of go back a little bit. Jonestown's actually the People's Temple is what that was called at the time. And then you got the Branch Davidians. Everybody hears David Chris, but there's actually sects or individual organizations. I don't know how better way to put that. And Manson was the family. All those people were involved. So Koresh, very influential, had people following him. Eventually his, I want to say congregation grew, right, Tony? It increased in numbers.
It did. His charisma, I mean, he used music in his teaching. He recorded some albums that were not released until after 1993. But he was a failed musician like Charles Manson. They were both failed musicians, but he was able to incorporate his music into his teachings, which kept the younger followers engaged in the congregation. You know how, not being sexist, but young women look at male pop stars. And in the old days, there was that glare, that glaze in the eyes, and they were their idol.
Look at the Beatles. Look at how many of his female fans were crying and going crazy, trying to crawl through fences, over fences and stuff to get at the Beatles. And that's kind of when I first saw it when I was young, because I do remember the Beatles being on Ed Sullivan way back when, and the following. It's kind of like took it that way then, right? About the following,
right? You know, he had enough and stayed with the mainstream of the Branch Davidian teaching, but he tuned it towards his benefit. So he was able to keep the young people. He had enough religious base in his teachings to keep the older generations there, and thus the families stayed as a unit in Mount Carmel.
Can we say that with Mount Carmel that there were generations that we were talking about? So we had people who had children born who actually were a second generation at Mount Carmel. Is that
yes? There were children born in Mount Carmel, and there were older adults that were in Mount Carmel.
Wow. Think of generations that were in Mount Carmel at the time when all this was taking place, and the people who were there. And let's talk about the growth. So you said 7 people were in that armed attack, right? That happened originally. What did the originally grow to under David Koresh?
Numbers range in that there were no census takers out there. Nobody kept direct contact or kept track of their numbers, but it was over 100. Between 100 and the lower hundreds at probably at its peak. And David Koresh used his charisma to keep everybody together based in religion, and then his charisma and his teachings that he was able to input what he wanted to occur, which being a narcissist revolved around him and what he wanted.
Was he instrumental in building the compound there in Waco? Did he actually have a hand in building that, or was that already there when he started?
There were parts of it that were there, and there was ongoing construction all the time. It had grown from, and it's odd, back in about 1983 on that site, there was kind of a larger administration building for the Branch Davidians at the time, and that burnt. Some of the congregation felt that Koresh had a hand in that, and at the time, Vernon Wayne Howell said that was God's judgment on the people. So things had been rebuilt over the years, and more had been added on to include underground storage area, bunkers, a buried school bus. For David's Koresh's prophecy through the book of Revelation of the end of times, the apocalyptic times that were going to come, was very adamant they were going to come. And now remember, we're dealing with a young man in his 30s at the time.
You know, and it was his own interpretation of the Bible and the parts. And anybody can go into the Bible. Let's say I don't want to turn this into a religious program, but you can go in there and make any interpretation you want, and people start becoming, I would get influenced by that interpretation. And the real interpretation, I think, is more benign, and it should be more of embracing people. Well, we talk about the apocalypse, talking about the end of times, and that interpretation, that influences a lot of people. And that's, I think, what happened here. Right, Tony?
Yes, he brought the end of times nearer in the future than saying, past my lifetime. No, it was going to occur in his lifetime. I mean, in 91, he truly started to believe that his martyrdom, and he used that term martyrdom, would occur here in the U.S. And through his belief that the end of times would come, most cult leaders is what David Koresh's group became, and that their views were outside the mainstream. But they have unite their people by embracing and getting their followers to embrace a common enemy. Jim Jones was the U.S. government and the CIA. David Koresh was the ATF, that they were the enemy and they were going to come and bring about the end of time.
Let me ask you, Tony, I want to move on a little bit here, but did Koresh actually believe this, or did he have more nefarious purposes? Did he have like a goal in mind, or did he truly believe this, or was he just influencing people for ulterior motives in this thing? It's a tough question, but
never having spoken to him, I can't tell you. Through people's readings, some of his followers that left, defected from his group, his cult, those that survived, truly believed and said, and have said in written words and in interview, that David Koresh believed in everything he was teaching, to include he was the next Christ. He was the Christ, the coming of the Son of God.
Ain't that something? And then look what it progressed to. And we're going to move a little bit forward here about the involvement of the government, specifically alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. It's now a BATFE, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And again, Tony retired from there. And kind of recap here, we have a senior special agent retired, Tony Piwowarcyzk, from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, who was actually on site at Waco when the things transpired regarding David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, and ultimately the ending there after 51 days that took place. And obviously, an investigation started at some point with the federal government, and I do know a little bit about that, but it involves some guns and other issues. Can you kind of touch a little bit about the government involvement more in monitoring Koresh and his activities?
There had been reports to the McClellan County Sheriff's Department. Mount Carmel is an unincorporated part of the county, from neighbors about hearing automatic weapon fire. In 92, a UPS driver was delivering a package. Now, by now, David Koresh realized he had to sustain his group, and he began a business called the Mag Bag, which was just a mile or so outside the main compound. It was just off the main highway there leading to Waco. The Mag Bag was a federal firearms licensee. They were able to sell firearms, and this UPS driver was delivering a package that he accidentally dropped. It broke open, and there were like a half dozen grenade shells in the package. He alerted the local ATF office, who had been aware of the reports of automatic weapon fire around Mount Carmel for some time. And at that point, they opened an investigation. There was heavy oversight on that investigation due to Koresh's professed beliefs and the connection to the Mag Bag, which was a licensed federal firearms licensee. So it wasn't one rogue agent. There was heavy oversight into this investigation.
And that's the point here. And let's talk a little bit about this, Tony. And I've known Tony for many years, since he was a St. Louis County police officer. And then we lost contact because he was traveling out. He was at a different location when he was ATF. But Tony and I have been friends for a while, and we're both believers in the Second Amendment. All right, Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. But the Second Amendment is not absolute, right, Tony? It's not absolute.
Well, and it also comes down to what type of firearms and what classification those are. In the case of the Mag Bag, the FFL, the Federal Firearms Licensee, they also had ordered numerous AR-15 lowers and some M16 uppers.
That's the lowers and uppers are different parts that make part of an AR-15 or M16. When M16 is the machine gun aspect.
Right. And so due to the reports of automatic weapon fire, there was belief that the Branch Davidians were turning semi-automatic weapons into automatic weapons. And without having that registered, it's a violation of the federal firearms laws and most state laws.
And when I say it's not absolute, in other words, Convicted felons cannot own a firearm or possess a firearm or ammunition. People who are either have a protective order or even a misdemeanor arrest for domestic violence cannot be possession of a weapon. Even retired police officers such as Tony and I, we are not allowed to have automatic weapons. You have to get special stamps and special authorization for that. So when I say it's not absolute, there are limitations within purchasing a firearm. Again, purchasing a firearm, if you buy one at a store, you have to go through a check within the federal government, and you also have to go through the standard application process where ask a bunch of questions. So the ATF is looking at some things that are outside the normal scope of firearms that could have been violations of the Federal Firearms Act, right, Tony?
Well, in addition to that, they had been receiving chemical shipments of magnesium, aluminum, and other powders that can be combined to then those empty grenade holes that were delivered to fill those grenade holes, seal them up, have a detonator or an initiator ignite the powder within and cause that to be a live grenade, not in the true modern sense, but in an improvised sense. So the possibility of grenades and automatic weapons, none of which were licensed or legally licensed to anybody within the Branch Davidian congregation or the federal firearms licensee of the mag bag, they weren't allowed to have.
Exactly. Were there any allegations of either child abuse or any other things regarding children on site, Tony, that that was coming out at that time?
Due to the nature of the number of young and infants that were on site, there have been rumors circulating, rumors by people that used to be part of David Koresh's congregation, his cult, that there was sexual abuse that was occurring as well as physical abuse. His belief in discipline was that every adult within Mount Carmel had the right to discipline a child, which included spanking, using wooden sticks, using objects to spank, to discipline the child. And then David Koresh's propensity towards younger women, 10, 12-year-old, that those allegations were also circulating.
Propensity meaning there are allegations that he was having physical encounters with these teenagers, right? Young girls.
David Koresh's professed belief in the women who were part of the Branch Davidians and married couples were that when a married couple came in, or as he gained his leadership ability, he said the marriages were annulled, that he was the only one who could have sex with the women. The husbands were to remain celibate, and his belief was that he was going to sow the seed of the next Messiah, of the new Messiah. And he did not place any chronological age limits on women that he desired or wanted to have sex with. There was one former member that said she was 10 years old when she was made his bride, and there was another one that said she was 12 years old when she was made his bride. And there's allegations that one was young as 14 that bore his child.
And let's talk about this a little bit about the multifaceted investigation. ATF was criticized, and Tony, you know about this too. During the siege of what I considered Koresh seizing the people inside the compound. That's what I mean, siege. And the subsequent, and people were blaming the ATF for this entire incident. Well, let me tell you my personal thoughts, which I believe is absolutely true. Multifaceted investigation means different parts. We have the part with the weapons. We have the part with maybe trying to make improvised explosive devices or bombs or other type of devices that can cause harm. And then how about the children? As I said many times, law enforcement speaks for the people that cannot speak for themselves. Now, I'm repeating it again. First, the children. You know, a child cannot say who's being abused. A child cannot say who's hurting them or assaulting them, especially 1, 2, 3, or 4-year-olds. Or does a 10-year-old have a capacity to really report what's going on? All right. And then we got to speak for the elderly, right? Again, elderly people being abused in nursing homes or being taken advantage of. And some of them who have dementia or some other type of mental health issues cannot speak for themselves. The next are people with mental health or mental disabilities. If they can't speak for themselves, they can verbalize what's happening to them being abused, either physically, sexually, or mentally abused. And then I'm not trying to be a smart ass here. Sorry for saying that. But how about animals? We actually train the Humane Society who investigate animal abuse. And can an animal say who's abused them? They don't have the way to verbalize. And when I talk about the David Koresh situation and the Branch Davidians, the protecting children to me was a very big part of this. I think that gets lost into ATF just trying to invade a compound. No, we're looking after children, right, Tony? Is that your thoughts too about what your thought is?
You know, that concern had been brought to the legal authorities, and they had visited Mount Carmel on a number of occasions and were never able to get cooperation from anybody within the congregation about any physical or sexual abuse of children. These allegations had come from former members, and they were not able to, the legal authorities were not able to concretely say that this was occurring, but there had been multiple reports of it from multiple people, different sources that corroborate the same topic. And that lends credence to the veracity of that allegation that it was occurring despite not being able to get confirmation on their visits. But you and I know when you're in a group of people, especially if a child is with their parent and being interviewed, they'll look to the parent sometimes for answers, for guidance, and the parent's going to direct them or have had conversation. The parent, or in this case, the leader, David Koresh, will have had conversations about, oh, none of this occurred. No, everything is fine. So as you said, the child's not going to have the mental capacity to report it. And then when they do get older, just the sheer peer pressure of living in that compound with their family and other followers, they're going to have developed a concept that it's okay. That's the way things are supposed to be.
And they're being indoctrinated to this aspect throughout their whole lives. Think about being born and being a youngster, all right? And having it build up through the entire time of being young and the influence that's put on you. So can we both agree that the ATF was the lead investigator in this case, Tony?
They were. In fact, progressed to the point where ATF put an undercover agent in there as wanting to become part of the congregation of David Koresh, and they established a forward observation post, which was a house at the end of the main driveway that was supposed to be college students attending college, of which the undercover agent was one of them. So it had developed to that point where they felt there was enough seriousness of allegations to warrant putting an undercover agent at risk going in to corroborate all these different rumors and allegations and reports, automatic gunfire, from all the surrounding community.
And this is where I think a lot of people don't really understand. They may not know, but having an undercover ATF agent in there who was substantiating the information and what was going on inside, that was huge. And that had been going on for a while. It just wasn't a one-day thing. They had been in there. They understood. So it wasn't just ATF going blindly and trying to do a search warrant here. They had the information. They had the investigation. They had the intelligence information from inside within. I got to hand it to that ATF agent going in there. And into a strange place with strange people, not knowing what's going to happen. So that intelligence information helped build the case initially, right, Tony? That was a part of the basis for the investigation that resulted in the ATF going on site.
Yes, and like I said, mind you, this is still being heavily monitored because now you have an undercover agent going into a religious organization that was determined to be a cult, that involved the federal firearms licensee that ATF is authorized to regulate. So the oversight on this is great. And the concern for Robert Rodriguez, who was the ATF agent, his safety while he was in the compound, that this was all occurring throughout 1992.
And so it was a long-term investigations. When I worked for with the DEA, these are called long-term investigation (LTIs), all right? And we used to call them details, drug trafficking organizations. This was an organization that was involved in a multifaceted but a firearms investigation. So it wasn't a quick response. ATF got so much criticized over this, which I thought was unwarranted because it was a long-term investigation, Tony, that ATF did.
It was, and I think the events that unfolded takes away from people understanding that this was a thought-out, planned investigation and subsequent planned execution of a federal search warrant and arrest warrant. So ATF developed probable cause. It was presented to a U.S. magistrate through the U.S. Attorney's Office
Right.
to get a federal search warrant for the property of Mount Carmel specifically defined, as well as the arrest of David Koresh.
And again, that is signed off by a magistrate or, let's say, a federal judge. Okay, kind of magistrate's a different position there within the federal judgeship. And that was authorized by the court, through a federal prosecutor had this happen. It just wasn't ATF going in there and doing an assault on a place. So they had the probable cause. And then the agents formulated a plan. Whenever you do a major operation, be it with ATF, DEA, FBI, or any other federal organization, you always have to have an operations plan, or you plan it out. Those are called ops plans. We wouldn't do anything at DEA without an ops plan. We know what we're going to do. We have all sorts of parameters we have to meet. And Tony, was an ops plan done today? Actually panel out pretty good for
This is not your typical ops plan.
Yeah.
And due to the size of the compound, the number of buildings, and over 100 people on site.
Think about that, 100 people that they have to worry about. Huge.
And multiple buildings with multiple entrances, exits, multiple levels. This plan had been originally there were supposed to be 5 ATF SWAT teams. At the time, they were called entry control teams to participate in this execution of the search warrant.
Not 5 people, 5 teams. Think about that.
5 teams that would consist of up to 10 to 15 individuals per team. Then it became cumbersome and the logistics was reduced to 3, the New Orleans team, the Houston team, and the Dallas team. St. Louis and Miami were the other 2 teams that were excluded from the ultimate plan. So we were on standby, St. Louis and Miami, when the raid occurred. The execution of the federal search warrant occurred on February 28th. So the planning stages was huge. The logistics, bringing everybody together to train, to plan around mock buildings, detail where everybody was supposed to go, their jobs, once the search warrant was being executed. And then after the execution of the search warrant, the gathering of the evidence, all that had to be planned for. Nobody knew that the events were going to unfold the way they did. So
nobody can. I mean, you have to plan for the unexpected. Tony, when I was working at DEA, I was involved in a lot of undercover operations, and you just don't have an undercover going. We have rescue teams. Mostly on the rescue team, you have to be prepared for the what ifs. And like you said, Tony, the what ifs of this is huge. When we did undercover ops, when I was involved in those, we had a team of probably 10 to 15 people total. The UC undercover, we had people doing the surveillances, we had the intelligence gatherers, we had a rescue team. And we all had our duties. And I'm thinking about the magnitude. This is like doing an undercover operation like a business or a house. You guys had a compound, at that time.
So from the original execution of the search warrant to people on hand to handle the children that we knew were on site, if there were any injuries, the gathering of the evidence, the sheer numbers of people that were involved that were going to be converted from those that went from executing the warrant to then you would become evidence gatherers and searchers or interviewers of everybody on count. Then you had to have people to care for the kids, any elderly that were on site. So this was a logistical nightmare when it came to planning everything, but it was well planned, and the potential for reinforcements, which was Miami and St. Louis, had been contemplated, and we were on standby. I had all my gear packed. And in the back of my government vehicle, I was in Los Angeles at the time doing an OCDF case.
That's under Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force. So, yeah.
I was out there, but all my gear was in the trunk of my vehicle parked at the airport in case we needed to be deployed. And when it occurred, I was in Los Angeles, got word, caught a flight, and got into and on site 2 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon on February 28th.
So the same day that this happens, Tony goes on site, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happened on site and what happened there. Again, I don't want to bring up bad situations about the agents being killed and the numerous people involved in this and injured, but we're going to go into that a little bit more in depth. I just want to kind of recap here. So here, I think we built a pretty good foundation of Koresh, right, Tony, about who the person was, the influence he had on people.
And he firmly believed in an armed apocalypse. That's why he armed and trained his congregation, his followers, in the use of an AR-15 platform weapon, the manufacturer of making them fully automatic, the conversion of grenade holes into grenades. They were all part of this, that the apocalypse was coming and it was going to be ATF, specifically the U.S. government through ATF, was going to bring about the end of times, and that David Koresh would be the leader, and they should follow him through this apocalypse to come out on the other side.
And that's going to tie into our next episode about, I think we built up pretty good about the person, the development of him into the Branch Davidians, where he took it. We have about 100 people on site in the compound. And then we also kind of built up about the allegations of sexual abuse or other type of abuses happened to the children and people inside, and the federal firearms violations that have been taking place, and the influence he had on these people. And I must say it was truly a cult. I mean, it was. There's people that did survive, a few people did survive the Waco incident. And we're going to continue that a little bit more with the next episode about what happened that day.
Also, remember the charisma that Koresh had. He told his followers where to sleep. He directed their diets. There was no dancing. There was no alcohol. There was no tobacco. He controlled their entire lives to include who became his wife and control of the daily activities, which included up to 3 Bible study sessions a day that could last multiple hours per session.
Yeah, and the influence he had over these people and what eventually happened there is pretty profound. So anyways, I want to thank everybody for joining us for this first of 2 episodes regarding the incident involving David Koresh, the Branch Davidians, and the Waco incident, which eventually led to the incident of the Oklahoma City bombing that happened. And anyways, I want to thank everybody for joining us on The Trend. So remember, stay tuned, stay informed. We do try to bring you the facts about the politics, just pure information. And all of our episodes, we try to have people who are actually there or present for these different things we're going to talk about. So for the time, my name's Gary Fortney. Have a good day, and this is The Trend. Thanks, everyone, for tuning into this episode of The Trend. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out to us at the Trend's website at www.trendmediallc.com, or you can email us at any time at thetrend@trendmediallc.com. We welcome everybody's comments, suggestions, or reviews. Don't forget to stay connected with us on social media. Follow us on TikTok and Instagram at Trend Media Podcast, and join the conversation on Facebook by searching The Trend Podcast. Check out our Amazon page through the link on our website, where you'll find some of our recommended products. We'll be back next time with more true crime stories, insights on law enforcement trends, and current trends with our region and the people we serve. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay part of The Trend.